All right, you guys, so this is the end of chapter 2. Sorry I'm out again today. I will be back Monday more permanently. So a couple of classes can just go ahead and skip until where we left off. But if you haven't done the slide yet, make sure that you do. So after Pocahontas leaves, we start to see peace deteriorate a little bit between the relationship between the Powhatan Confederacy and the Jamestown settlers. We also see a series of severe epidemics hit the Powhatan Confederacy, one in 1617 and one in 1619. And in these epidemics, Chief Powhatan dies. And so his half-brother, Opechancanough, will take over, and he becomes the supreme chief. Now remember, Opechancanough was taken and raised, or not raised, but spent time in Spain. He's very cautious and very wary of the settlers, and he's been seeing this warfare and this tension, and his niece be sold off or married off into this, and his brother die, and he's frustrated, and he's not having this positive relationship thing with the Jamestown settlers. He's seen the settlement continue to grow, he's seen them take a stronger and stronger hold, and he's seen warfare continue. So he decides to organize an all-out assault on the English settlers. So on March 22nd of 1622, he leads a series of coordinated attacks on Jamestown that kill 347 settlers, which is nearly a third of the English population in the area. The attackers kill men, women, and children. They burn homes and crops, and it's pretty brutal. There is scalping, there is dismemberment, and it is, just imagine watching that carnage take place. The goal was to dislodge the colonists, right? To be so brutal as to scare them off and make them never want to come back. And unfortunately, that doesn't work. I will talk about why. Sorry, in just a second. But it is absolutely brutal, and this does have some pretty serious consequences. So first and foremost, I think it's trying to understand the perspective of both sides here, right? So from the Native perspective, it's, we have seen these people move into our land, and we've seen all this violence that they've caused and all of this, so we need to get them out of here. But for the settlers as well, if you watch your family be dismembered in front of you, you're not going to have very positive feelings towards the people who did that, right? You're going to be angry. You're going to want revenge. And so that's what we're going to see take place. And both of those make sense. It's not just this pure, remember, up until this point, we really have this idea of the noble savage in place, right? They're good. They can be saved. They're just like children. So that's going to be the biggest shift that we see after the Indian War of 1662, after this attack, is rather than thinking of and sort of using propaganda to push this idea of the noble savage, we're going to switch over to the evil savage. So you should also write that down in your notebooks. But the evil savage is more of an idea of, no, they just need to be exterminated, right? There's no redeemable qualities. They can't be saved. They're not noble. They're just evil. They just want to kill us. And so we need to kill them before they kill us. And we are going to see that switch take place. And this is, from then on, particularly in Virginia, the natives are just going to be seen as, these terrifying, godless, heathenistic demon creatures who need to be killed, otherwise they will scalp your wife and kill a baby, right? So that's really what this switches. We now begin seeing people as evil savages instead. This also leads into a 10-year war until we finally get a peace treaty in 1632. But this is temporary, and this really does change things. Our policy is going to be that of extermination, particularly coming from Virginia for a while. And it's also not just going to be limited to the Powhatan Confederacy, right? It'll be sort of all Indians are the same. They all are dangerous. They all need to be exterminated. Now, the reason why this wasn't successful at dislodging the colonies is because we have found our cash crop. If you look back here, right, we've got 1622. By 1620, we have already found tobacco. So the fate of Virginia is going to be tobacco. This is the first cash crop that we grow. We find that it grows incredibly well in the New World. John Rolfe is actually credited with the first person to really notice the tobacco plant growing. It grew wild in West Virginia. And so in 1617, we began planting it purposefully to grow a crop. Now, at the time, tobacco was a very expensive luxury in Europe. Europeans did have tobacco, but only the wealthy could afford to purchase it. And so with finding that it grows well in the New World, we know that we can make a lot of money, right? This is basic supply and demand. If something is popular but in short supply, it's going to be very expensive because there's a high demand. So if you can meet that demand, you're going to make a lot of money and become very wealthy, which is what happens. The first crop is planted in 1617. By 1620, we are exporting 60,000 pounds of tobacco. By 1624, that's jumped to 200,000 pounds. By 1638, we're up to 3 million pounds, and by 1700, we are exporting 35 million pounds of tobacco to England. So this is a very rapid and explosive expansion of tobacco production. A couple things here. First, I think this is one of those areas we can point to where it really shows that economics drive a lot of things, right? Despite this brutal massacre, people are willing to stay because of the opportunity of making money, because they have that option. And the second thing is, with this explosion of the growth of tobacco, we're going to need people to grow the tobacco. So we're going to see a huge increase in the demand for labor after we find tobacco. Now, shortly after tobacco begins being grown also, we are going to see a switch in how England begins dealing with their colonies. So, hold on. Oh man, I'm tired, sorry. In 1624, King James will revoke the company charter. So what that means is he had allowed, right, the Virginia Company, this private company, to control, run, and own the colonies in Virginia up until this point. But in 1624, King James says, no, Virginia is now British, right? It's now owned by the crown. It's now run by the crown. I control it. The state controls it. It officially is a royal colony. And with this, we are going to set up a system of government. Now, his reasoning behind this is he's saying, well, there's a very high mortality rate in the colonies, disease is rampant, there's mismanagement going on, so the crown has to take it over. So if we were using our comparison from last class, this would be like if SpaceX makes it to Mars and sets up a colony, and then the United States government was like, yeah, that colony is now our colony, right? We know you put in that work, but we're going to run it now because you're not running it correctly. And although it's because of mismanagement, they also found profit, so that might be part of it too. The House of Burgesses is the governing body of Virginia. And so we have an assembly of representatives, and those representatives are going to make the laws and do all of that, and they are elected by the people living in Virginia. The king and queen have final say on all the laws, right? They have to be approved by the king, but they do get to make some of their own laws. All right, Maryland. So Maryland is going to make up our other half of the Chesapeake region, right? If you look on the wall of that map, if you remember where I pointed out Virginia was, and then we've got Maryland over here, the Chesapeake Bay runs through both of these modern-day states. And so Maryland is gifted to Lord Baltimore in 1634, or 1632 it's gifted, but they moved there in 1634. And King Charles I, who's the king at the time, gives George Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore, 6.5 million or 6.4 million acres in the northern Chesapeake region. And the intent is that it will become a refuge for Catholics. Charles I was fairly sympathetic towards Catholics. He's worried about their persecution in England, and so he wants it to be a Catholic refuge. However, that doesn't happen. Maryland is going to become relatively indistinguishable from Virginia. They're going to have very similar society, economy, politics, culture, and all of that will be centered around the growth and exportation of tobacco. Again, this cash crop. People want to come over and come to this region because they want to make money. We're also mostly going to see Protestant settlers, so it didn't turn out to be this big Catholic refuge, but this completes our Chesapeake region, which is made up of both Maryland and Virginia, and again, both of them really center around tobacco and trying to make that profit. Now, we're also going to need people to grow the tobacco. All right, so this is where indentured servants come in the picture. Now, slaves will be used later, but at the time, slaves weren't actually the best option. They were far more expensive than indentured servants, and neither lived very long. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to pay for slaves to come over. What made much more sense was to pay for indentured servants. Many people in England were experiencing this wave of overcrowding. We see a shift in the countryside where they're now raising more sheep so they can make textiles, right? They can get the wool, and that is less labor intensive. So you have more people out of work and more people crowding into the cities, which causes poverty to rise because there's not very much work in the cities either. So the New World, or this land of opportunity, seems like a perfect option for people to immigrate to. Unfortunately, coming to the New World was incredibly expensive. It was about a year's wage for a servant or laborer, which is very hard to save, right? Because consider, you can't just, not spend money for a year. You have to pay for housing. You have to pay for food. You have to pay for clothing and for laundry. You have to pay taxes. You have to support your family. So saving up that much money is very unrealistic for most people, and so they will turn to this option of signing an indenture. And an indenture basically means that someone else will pay your passage to the New World. They will essentially give you a loan in exchange for work. So you sign this contract, which says that you will work between 4 to 7 years, and it would specify the amount, in exchange for a passage to the New World. And then once you worked for that time, you would then be free. Now, this isn't just being a servant and, working a couple hours a day. Many of the indentured servants were treated similarly to, the institution of slavery, but they did have that opportunity of becoming free at the end, which slaves did not. Now, the people who benefit clearly are going to be the planters here. So ideally, how this works is for everyone to win, right? Across the board, it's a win-win. In the ideal situation, poor immigrants would be able to trade their freedom and ability to work for a trip to the New World, and in the end, they're supposed to end up with freedom and land, so they can then become successful and, plant and do their own thing. But in reality, the planters are really going to be the ones who are benefiting most, right? And the planters are the people who own the farms, who are planting the tobacco, raising the tobacco, and who need labor. Now, the planters benefit for several reasons. First of all, not only do they get labor, but they're also going to get a head right. Now, a head right is 50 acres of land, which was promised to everyone who paid for a charter over. Now, hypothetically, the indentured servants themselves should be getting this land, but because they didn't actually pay for the trip over, the people who paid for their passage, which are the people who bought their indenture, are getting the land instead, if that makes sense. So it's not, the 50 acres doesn't go to the person who took the passage, it goes to the person who paid for the passage, which would be the planters. So with every indentured servant, they're automatically also getting 50 acres of land. Furthermore, within 1 year of service, the cost is already covered. So after about a year of service, the cost of the indentured servant is done. So anything on top of that is just pure profit, right? If they live 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, however long, all of those years after that first year are just profit on top of your debt, right? You're getting free labor out of it because you're only really paying for that first year of service. And finally, this is a weird benefit, but about half of indentured servants actually died before living out all of their indenture, largely due to illnesses. Now, obviously, the planters lose out on free labor here, and the servants lose out for obvious reasons. They're dead, but they also don't have to, grant them any freedom dues or anything like that, and you don't have competition then. Right, you don't have these servants who are now becoming free and trying to compete with the planters before. So the planters, this is definitely most beneficial for them. Colonial mortality rate as a whole, so we're talking about all these servants dying, it's high. You have a lot of people dying across the board. And this early death also helps explain why we're not buying slaves yet, right? Slaves are incredibly expensive, and paying for someone for life who's incredibly expensive isn't worth it if they're just going to die 3 years in, just like an indentured servant is going to die 3 years in, right? So indentured servants make the most economic sense. Slaves don't. So much of this is really about economics, and I really want to emphasize that, and we'll continue to do so as we go through this. There's a lot of reasons why people are dying, lots of disease. So I've got dysentery, typhoid fever, malaria, water is contaminated if people are trying to drink that. 1 in 4 children will die in infancy, and half of children will die before the age of 20. That means, like, look around your classroom, half of you guys would be dead before the age of 20, and then on top of that, right, your likelihood of dying is still very high. Despite this very rapid mortality rate, we still actually do see population growth, and that is because of immigration, right? So there's this big difference between natural population growth, which means that people are just having babies, and those babies are living, and people in general are living longer, and external population growth, which is where people are immigrating into the country, and that's why you're seeing the population go up. So why are people dying? Well, lots of reasons. First off, we have to remember that no one is really immune to the local environment. We have to get used to it. We need several generations in there to get more comfortable. But besides, disease and new variations of plagues and, bad, harsh living conditions, all that good stuff, there's also a couple other reasons. One, we have very primitive medical knowledge. There's very little understanding of infection or sterilization. Many people would die from infections contracted during childbirth or surgery. A lot of people use dirty instruments or dirty hands when trying to deliver a baby or performing surgeries or things like that. And then you have infectious diseases transmitted by garbage and by unclean water. Right, so people don't really understand this concept of infection or contamination or sterilization. If someone, got their arm cut off, you don't want to pick up the same saw that you were using to, saw through wood or, pig bone and then saw through someone's arm to amputate it, right, and then not clean it. You don't want to grab the rag from the ground that you'd just been mopping up horse manure with and throw it on someone's amputated arm to stop the bleeding. So we don't really understand that cleanliness aspect, which is not going to help with keeping people alive. Sterilization is important, and lack of sterilization leads to infections. The water is also really unclean. People would dump their sewage into it and then drink it, right? That's not great for you, and that's part of also why people drank so much beer is because you could just, the alcohol was supposed to kill some of the bacteria in the water, so you could drink watered down beer like that and be healthier. We also based a lot of our medicinal practices on humoralism. And humoralism is a theory that actually comes from the 2nd century Roman physician, a guy named Galen. Humoralism believes that you have 4 humors in your body, and those humors need to be balanced. And if they're not balanced, then you get sick. So the 4 humors are yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And if you do not have those balanced humors, you get sick. So in order to correct that sickness, you need to correct the imbalance. And so you could be prescribed a remedy. If you have too much yellow bile in your system, you might be prescribed purging, meaning you need to puke. If you have too much black bile, then maybe you need to expel. So you would be prescribed expulsion. So you'd be given laxatives, and you would need to evacuate your bowels. Too much blood or bad blood in you, right? We've got bleeding. That's probably the most famous, either by cutting your arm and bleeding you or by putting leeches on and bleeding you. But that's basically our entire medical system is based off of this. Medicine is not yet at the point where we're using the scientific method, right? We have no evidence that these cures work. It's just sort of let's try it and faith, and hopefully they'll survive. And so, it might even be more helpful not to call the doctor because they weren't going to do a whole lot to help you anyway. Now, lives of indentured servants aren't all that fantastic. Because of the high mortality rate, indentured servants don't live that long. About half of them will die before their indenture expires. And while they were in this indenture, theme of the day is death, right? We have lots and lots and lots of death. But while they were indentured, they were treated as property. Their contracts could be sold, and they have no control over who purchased their labor. So they could be bought and sold on a whim. There's no families staying together or anything like that. The need for labor really outweighs the moral issue of treating servants as property. So, for example, we're going to add on lots of severe laws to keep servants in place and lots of harsh punishments for petty crimes to try to control the servant population. Punishments could often be longer lengths of servitude. So if you do something, you could have years tacked on to your sentence, which keeps you there more and more perpetually. Christopher Adams, for example, ran away for 6 months. He ultimately was captured and then sentenced to 3 extra years of service. Or Richard Higbee, he ended up killing 3 hogs and was given 6 extra years of service. So that was often a punishment that was tacked on and very beneficial for the planters. In terms of women, there weren't that many women indentured servants initially, but we are going to see an increase and we're going to start to see more. Now, women weren't treated great. They were prohibited from marrying until their service expired. However, the pressure to have sex was very, very high. There was a low number of women in the colonies. There weren't that many women coming over. And so you see a lot of immigrant women or indentured women being pressured into having sex. You do see a lot of rape or assaults. And then also you see, you can kind of just see through the numbers, high levels of premarital sex, because 1/3 of immigrant women were pregnant when they got married. But even with that, if a woman in servitude gave birth to a child, she would automatically have a pregnancy penalty. She would have to serve 2 extra years and then pay a fine on top of that. The father of the unborn child occasionally purchased the indenture if they were in that position and freed and married her, but not always. And so oftentimes you would be penalized, and only the mother would be penalized for getting pregnant. So who are most of our immigrants to the Chesapeake region? Well, most of them are men between the ages of 15 and 25. About 3 out of 4 of the indentured servants are men. Most of them are single men. Most of them don't have families. They often tend to be unskilled workers, although some do have some experience with agricultural work. We tend not to have skilled craftsmen because they have a tendency to be able to make more money. But if we do, skilled craftsmen could often get shorter contracts to shorten the length of their service because their work was more valuable. Even though they were servants, they do have very vast restrictions on their lives. Again, they could not legally marry. They could not legally have children until their terms expired. They could be bought and sold with no say as to where. They could be separated from their families. All things very similar to slavery, but they did know that their term would expire. So they did have the potential to leave. As for family life, there is a high number of married couples without children, and this is due more to the high infant mortality rate, right? A lot of kids die. And this is part of why a lot of people have a lot of kids, is because the likelihood is that your children will die. More than 1/2 of the colony's children had lost at least one parent, and about 1/5 had no relatives in Virginia whatsoever, again, because the mortality rate was so high, right? There was so much death around that most people could have expected to lose a parent, and then 20% had no living relatives left and just kind of had to figure it out. This is very, very different from New England, which we will talk about next week, where entire families come over together, right? Where this isn't single people traveling over and trying to figure it out. It's families coming together as a whole. And then for women, because women were so rare, they also were more desired. So sometimes you would have prospective women shipped to the colonies as prospective wives. Settlers were willing to pay about 120 pounds of their best leaf tobacco for women. So it's sort of like a colonial version of mail-order brides. Women will remain in the minority until the late 17th century because if you're really looking for labor, right, most of the planters preferred men for field work. Women, if they were brought over, would generally do household work, cooking, washing, cleaning, gardening, milling, stuff like that. But again, largely because of this labor demand, they will remain the minority until the late 17th century. Now, that being said, the women who did go over ended up weirdly having a little bit more control over their lives than, say, women in the New England colonies. Few women remained unmarried for long because there were so few women. They were a hot commodity. They had a lot more prospects. The average woman married in their late teens at the time, and because of the high mortality rate, or the high mortality rate for children, they tended to have a lot of children. So they were pregnant every 2 years and averaged, let me emphasize that, they averaged 8 children. Can you imagine giving birth? That's props to them. But that's on average. So you have people having way more kids than that. Women were also a lot more likely to have premarital sex. They have, It's more likely that they won't have the control of both parents. It's more likely that they'll be out on their own. And because there are, so many less people there, it's also more likely that, they'll be pushed into it. But despite the struggles and the hard times, there's also some benefits to being a woman in Chesapeake society, particularly compared to like New England society or even British society. Because they were so scarce, they often have more power and more freedom than women in other areas. They have more choice in picking a spouse, right? Because they have far more suitors. They have a lot more options, and with those options comes a little bit more negotiating power and control. Additionally, they often have no or few male relatives. So they might not have a father, or they have, or maybe no uncles or things like that to influence their marriage choice or their decision. They also had a tendency to outlive their husbands. And what that meant is they would often inherit the control of the business or property. They were left with the children and the farm and the plantation, and they would have to run it. But that gives them a lot more power than they would have somewhere in like Europe, for example. So a lot of hardship, but also significant economic power. The ability to have control over your life and choose what you spend money on. Even widows wouldn't stay single for long. If they didn't have any sons, the surest way to get help on the farm was to marry someone who may have had sons to help. So we see a lot of blended families in Virginia, right? Lots of people who, had half siblings or step siblings, or people who had been married multiple times, or, intricate interwoven relationships because of the high mortality rate. Also, there's a lot of orphans, a lot of people with no family or property. And so we actually see the Chesapeake colonies create one of the earliest systems to protect and control orphans to help support them. So, some conclusions regarding our servant labor system. One of the defining characteristics of the Chesapeake colonies and culture is that land is readily available. So free people work their own land, right? Because there was so much land, anyone who was free was going to go get their own land, right? You wouldn't want to work for someone else if you could have your own farm. So free people would work their own land, right? And this is very different from somewhere like England or France, where free people, right, you weren't enslaved or you weren't a servant or anything like that, but you would often work for someone else, right? You didn't own your own land and work your own land because the nobles owned everything. But here, that wasn't a thing, right? You couldn't hire free people because anyone who was free would just have their own land because there was so much land. So there's, again, this very high demand for labor by the planters. One of the ways they get around this, of course, is trying to find legal ways to extend servitude, but also just importing very high numbers of indentured servants to work in the fields. Now, indentured servants wanted to obtain freedom, right? That's the goal. They wanted to start families and get a chunk of land as soon as possible. And so workers do see themselves in a more temporary state of servitude, and so they do have that goal to look for. And then at the time, right, we still have slaves being incredibly expensive and hard to come by. So there's several, we're going to see how we transition here. But even within the slave population, right, we have a very high mortality rate. Slaves are also dying very early on, and slaves are far more expensive than indentured servants. So there's no point, right? We're not going to buy a slave because it's just not economically worth it. As we get into the 1680s and 1690s, and we're going to talk about this transition, we really do see that start to change. But initially, with this huge demand for labor, we are just filling it with indentured servants because it does not make economic sense to buy slaves yet. So what changes? That's the question. There's a couple issues here. First, planters are growing more and more tobacco. As they grow more and more tobacco, we're ultimately going to see reduced profits. Now, this is done essentially by flooding the market. So what this means, this goes back to the basic supply and demand economics, right? If you have a lot of a single product, it's going to be easier to get that product from other people, and the price then goes down. If you have a more exclusive profit, it's going to be much easier to maintain a high price. So As we have the colonies expanding, as more and more people begin growing tobacco, as planters begin growing more and more tobacco, suddenly tobacco is readily available, right? Suddenly we're exporting like 60 million pounds of tobacco or whatever. So as we're exporting that much tobacco, all of a sudden it's really easy and cheap to get tobacco in the New World because there's so much of it, right? So the price drops. And as the price drop, that has the effect of planters, again, trying to grow even more tobacco to make up for that price difference. Now, so profits are being reduced. This also means it's hard for freed servants to save up enough money to become landowners themselves. And so we see two things happen. One, there's less of an incentive to become an indentured servant because the likelihood of you being successful on your own land declines. So why give up your freedom if you can't make a profit afterwards? Why give up your freedom if you can't own your own land and be profitable in that land afterwards? The second thing that happens with this too is that even people who did give up their freedom, right, and were indentured servants and outlived their indenture, even if they can get their hands on land, they're not being successful. So that means we're seeing a growing portion of a free but unhappy and frustrated poor white class. They want the money that the wealthy planters have. They want the riches that the wealthy planters have, and they don't have the ability to get it. And so the more indentured servants who outlive their indenture, who become free, the larger that class grows. And that's going to be very important. And finally, the mortality rate in Chesapeake is declining. So we're seeing more people living longer. More and more servants are surviving to become free, which means more and more landless, discontented people. And so they are going to become their own political class. Additionally, as planters and planter families live longer, we are going to see the formation of the planter elite, right? You're able to then pass your land on to your children and begin building this empire. And so we're going to see the wealthy become more wealthy and the poor become more poor, and the poor class is also growing. Now, there's a variety of reasons as to why people are living longer. There's more immunities. As we have second and third generation people, the societies are becoming more established. They're more prosperous. There's better conditions. There's less malaria, things like that. And so we, again, across the board, this is going to be a really, really important point, is that we see this declining mortality rate. Now, the biggest social and political differences at the time are not white and black. It's free and unfree. Hi, Liz. Hold on one second.
Any of my copies, the study hall copies? I am short on your book.
All right. Sorry about that, guys. So we are also seeing a huge population growth, both internally as people are beginning to live longer, but also with the continued immigration, so external population growth. But we're definitely seeing more natural than we saw before. We are also, with this, we're going to see a lot of tension arise, right? As we have more and more people growing, that causes tension not only within the community, but also externally. With more people, that means they want more land. And when they want more land, that means that they're going to expand. And expansion means they're going to bump up against the people who are already there, chiefly the Native American tribes. So, looking at the government really quickly. The biggest, again, political difference and the biggest social divide, the biggest divide period is free versus unfree. And this means anybody. There are free black people and free white people, enslaved black people and in servitude white people. So across the board, we see the biggest political difference being free and unfree. There's also a growing political difference between the planter elite, so the wealthy planters who are free, and then the yeoman farmers, or the more poor free people. So we have this big growing divide between the wealthy free people and the poor free people. Now, as more and more servants are surviving and more servants are earning their freedom, like we talked about, we begin to see the development of a second social and political polarization, like we said, right, between the wealthy and between the poor, even though they are all free. At the time, the House of Burgesses, right, or which is this guy, the House of Burgesses, or which is just another name for the Virginia government, is run by a guy named William Berkeley. And until 1670, all freedmen were able to vote in the Virginia government. They tended to elect prosperous planters. The idea is they know what they're doing. They have the time to run this. But we do see that eventually revoked. So starting in 1661, Governor Berkeley stops calling elections. So he refused to call an election for the House of Burgesses for 15 years. So he's like, I'm just not going to let anyone else be elected, because he's very wary of this growing political class. And during his reign, by 1670, he outlaws voting by poor men. So you're only allowed to vote if you were a man who headed the household and were a landowner. And that's really not that many people. On top of this, we are going to see tensions continue to, arise with Virginia's Indian policy. So if we remember back, right, we have Opechancanough come in the picture again. He is the Algonquin chief who took over from Powhatan, who led the earlier 1622 attack, when we see that change that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, right, when we see that change from the native tribes being seen as noble savages to evil savages. So he's still here. 22 years later, right? He lives to a ripe old age. And they will lead a massive surprise attack again in 1644. And this surprise attack leads to 2 years of fighting. They kill 500 Virginia colonists in a 2-day period. And this, again, leads into that war. Eventually, the colonists will gain the upper hand by capturing and then executing Opechancanough. And with their leader dead, this is going to lead into a treaty that concluded the war and established the future Indian policy of the Chesapeake region. They attempt to maintain this policy for the next 30 years. Now, the policy is that the Indian tribes gave up all claims to land that were already settled by the English. So rather than attempting to push them out to get rid of them, they're just saying, okay, fine, you can keep what you already have. And in exchange, all of the wilderness beyond the fringe of settlement was supposed to be reserved exclusively for Indian use, which means, they can't expand anymore. That's it. They've expanded enough. They have all of the land they're ever going to have, and then everything else is reserved for Indian use. The problem is that this is doomed, and that's because the number of land-hungry colonists is multiplying, right? Poor farmers who do have some land want more so they can compete with the wealthy tobacco owners. Newly freed indentured servants want some land, period, right? That's what they came over for, this hope of being able to own your own land. And so with this restriction of you can't expand and the, restriction on voting rights, right? You can't vote unless you own land. People are like, well, how on earth am I supposed to own land if we're not allowed to expand and we're not allowed to change the policy? So this policy isn't really about protecting the natives, this idea that you can't expand further. It's not like a respect thing. It's attempting to minimize contact between settlers and between Indians, and that's really with the hope of keeping the peace. All right, remember, every time we talk about war is expensive. And so the House of Burgesses doesn't want to pay for it. Safety is cheaper than providing the settlers with troops to protect them. And so trying to find a way to prevent war from happening is the cheapest option. Additionally, the other major option here is that, or major perk here for the wealthy class, is that if the landless folks can't get land, suddenly there will be a new cheap labor source, right? If their only option is to work for the wealthy elite, that's a great option, right? All of a sudden, they have new cheap labor without having to import indentured servants and constantly keep freeing them. So this seems like a great idea to everybody. However, as the population grows, we are going to see more and more people disobey the order and the law of the land and begin expanding out into the frontier. And as that happens, we have more conflict with the natives, but also there's going to be increasing tension between the government itself. Enter Nathaniel Bacon. So Nathaniel Bacon was the leader of a group of unhappy colonists who really wanted land. And he is going to lead an uprising against the planter elite. He says that they operate for their own personal gain, And they do nothing to help out, the average person. And he also is clearly stating that he wants revenge against the protected and darling Indians. Now remember, this reaction, too, comes from some of these massacres, right? If you heard tales of the massacre of 1622, or you lived through the massacre of 1644, right? You see that brutality, you're not going to think very favorably of the people out there. And again, it also makes tons of sense why they led that massacre. But it's only, tensions are continuing to arise. And so there's a lot of anger and frustration targeted towards the Indian tribes and towards the ruling elite, who they feel are protecting those tribes who then murdered everybody and preventing them from getting land. So this leads us to Bacon's rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon begins speaking out against Governor Berkeley, and he declares that, quote, "Our design is not only to ruin and extirpate all Indians in general, but all manner of trade and commerce with them." So he's going to use a lot of rhetoric with anger directed towards the Indian tribes, again, because he's playing on that fear and that anger and that frustration of the massacre and targeting the ruling class as well with that. Governor Berkeley then declares Bacon a rebel. He's like, "You are terrible. You are being far too rebellious." And then they call for a new election to the House of Burgesses. And this does not work. So he's like, "Help me declare Bacon a rebel." And ultimately, when he finally calls for a new election of the House of Burgesses, Bacon ends up being elected to the House of Burgesses, right? People are so fed up with the fact that they hadn't been able to vote for 15 years, they vote everyone out. So Bacon's election into the House of Burgesses also kind of shows a broader support for a change in Indian policy. So in the House of Burgesses, Bacon is going to begin attempting to pass a series of laws that he calls Bacon's Laws. Bacon's laws gave local settlers a voice in setting tax levies. It forbids office holders from demanding bribes or extra fees for carrying out their duties, and it places a limit on holding multiple offices. So you can't be the secretary and the treasurer and the, president, right? And he restores the vote to any freedman. So you don't have to own property to vote now. He says if you are free, you can vote. Now, because Berkeley had labeled Bacon a traitor, and people get really mad about it, Berkeley ultimately will pardon Bacon. And this is all, you don't really need to know these details. But once Bacon finds out that Berkeley had called him a traitor, he gets real mad, and he declares war on Berkeley and all the other grandees or the elite planters. So we see all-out war break out. And this war lasts for about 3 months. The war consists of Bacon's people fighting the Indians and fighting the Berkeley's people, and Berkeley's people are trying to ward off attacks from Bacon, and everybody's fighting everybody, and most people are fighting the Indians, sacking plantations. The Indians are trying to attack Jamestown and get them out. And the fighting lasts until Bacon unexpectedly dies of dysentery. So he dies, and then everything's over. Berkeley's loyalists then run into the homes of Bacon's supporters and plunder everything. But even though this war is incredibly anticlimactic in terms of Bacon's early death from pooping himself to death, it is the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion which is incredibly important. Royal troops are sent in. So the king sends in a bunch of royal troops to restore peace once again and to replace Governor Berkeley and to nullify all of Bacon's laws. So they get rid of all of the changes that Bacon had made, but they also kick out the guy who was in charge before because they're very aware that no one likes him and they think he's responsible for this mess. Several of Bacon's allies were hung for destroying farms. And through the getting rid of Bacon's laws, this also just strengthens the power of the grandees or the wealthy elite. Right? So coming all the way back here, all the way back to the 1600s, we see a very deep divide between rich white people and poor white people in the South. And this will only continue through other southern states. And this is going to play a very important role even to this day of this divide that we see between the poor whites, or what they're often referred to as white trash, and the wealthy whites. And their experience is very, very different. And so it's important to understand that as we understand U.S. history as a whole. Ultimately, what this comes down to, the big conclusion, the takeaway, what we've learned from this, why this is important, is what the government learns is that they would rather fight Indians than they would fight their own people. It is safer to fight the Indian tribes than it is to fight the colonists. And so what they basically decide is to change their Indian policy. It becomes the government policy to not try to restrict colonial expansion, right? So this isn't, done out of the interests of the lower class or the interests of the Indians. It's just sort of like, we don't want to have to do this all over again, so we're not going to. So the government stops trying to stop land encroachment. There is sort of this mentality of, go figure it out for yourselves, right? We're not necessarily going to protect you, but you can expand if you want to. Now, why is Bacon's Rebellion so important? Why does this set the stage for future U.S. history? Why should you pay super careful attention to everything that's going on here? Well, one of the biggest reasons why is because during Bacon's Rebellion, the government learns a very important lesson. And that lesson is that they are scared of poor white people. And they need to find a way to make poor white people less of a group. And this is going to be one of the biggest catalysts for our transition from indentured servants to slaves. Now, this really is a ripple effect of Bacon. There's pros and cons of Bacon's Rebellion. So there are pros and cons to both indentured servants and to slaves, but what we're going to see is while in the beginning of the colonies, the pros far outweighed the cons for indentured servants, we're going to start to see that switch. The pros are going to begin to outweigh the cons for slaves rather than indentured servants, and this happens for a variety of reasons, but this is a very important shift. The biggest and most important thing to understand is that this is about economics. Slaves become the better economic option. They become more economically viable. They make more sense, right? And they will make you more money. And indentured servants become less economically viable. Now, there's a bunch of other reasons that surround this too, but that is the core part. If slaves weren't the better economic option, we would not have switched to the system of slavery. But they became the better economic option as we see several things happening. One of the biggest things that's happening is that life expectancy is increasing. So this means two things. One, servants aren't dying, right? Whereas before, about half of indentured servants would die, which means that you don't have very many new, free, landless, poor whites. Now, most indentured servants are living, which about doubles the size of that poor, white, landless class. And that is a group of people who you're terrified of now. You just saw with Bacon's Rebellion, right? You don't want that to ever happen again. So with more people living longer, that means indentured servants are outliving their indenture, which means that we just don't want that, right? We're scared of those poor people. And two, it also means that slaves are living longer. So as the mortality rate is also declining for slaves are living longer and they can't become free. So with life expectancy increasing, it becomes more cost-effective to invest in a slave rather than a series of indentured servants who also have the downside of becoming a poor, unruly, free class that you don't like. So now you can purchase a slave and you can see that population growth be sustained. You can use them for life. You have a perpetual workforce. And then on top of that, you have those perks of it's easier to control them because they have a different skin color and because they are enslaved and they will never be free and they can't blend in. So as a whole, we are seeing this general switch begin to happen, right? So, but the core reason there is it is more economically viable to purchase slaves as we head into the late 1800s and late 1600s and early 1700s. So really by the 1680s, we are beginning to see this switch. So again, we're specifically talking about the Chesapeake region here, but you can really see this reflected in the numbers, right? And if we go back to, and look at Bacon's Rebellion, right? This is one of the biggest catalysts. It's going to be right in the mid-1670s. We're starting to see the switch too. So in 1670, almost the entire population of Chesapeake is white. Now, this doesn't mean that there are not Black people in Chesapeake. In fact, there are free Black people in Chesapeake. For a while, we were freeing any slave who converted to Christianity. So you definitely have a mix, but almost the entire population is white. By 1700, 1 in 8 is African, and by between 1670 and 1700, we see the African population increase fivefold. This is going to severely sharpen class differences because that 1/4 of the white population who can own slaves are going to be very wealthy. Now, 75% of white families do not own servants and do not own slaves. So how do you convince them that the system of slavery is a good idea, that this is something that you should be on board with? You are going to emphasize the color of their skin, and you are going to emphasize freedom. So although the idea is, although you don't currently own slaves, although you are not currently wealthy, you are free and you are white and you have the ability to one day do that. So we're going to emphasize this idea of freedom and whiteness going alongside of freedom. Now again, slavery did not just jump up overnight. The institution itself didn't just appear overnight. This is something that slowly begins to grow with a series of laws over decades and decades that start to be put in place. At first, slavery couldn't be passed down from mother to child. They had to make a law that included that. Slaves could make their own money until they passed a law that said they couldn't. So this is a very gradual process for this to be institutionalized. And because of that, too, in the beginning, we do see, not all Black people being slaves. So all slaves were Black, but not all Black people were slaves. Nearly all Black people in Virginia were slaves, but we did have a free Black population. And in the reverse as well, almost all free people were white, and all white were free, or were just temporarily bound in indentured servitude. Only prosperous whites could afford to buy slaves, so again, that's just going to deeply sharpen class differences along these racial divides. And this really creates our racial ideology. So what does it mean to be free? You can own property. You can marry. You can have a family. You can transfer your property and your freedom to your descendants, so your children get to inherit your property and your freedom. You can move when or where you want. You can associate with anyone you want freely. You can serve on a jury. You can vote. You can hold political office. So you have all of these privileges that come with freedom that you do not have when you were enslaved. And these freedoms are going to be emphasized. And so these differences, this idea of freedom is going to be the core of how the wealthy slaveholders sort of sell this to the poor whites. They attempt to unite white colonists under the ideology of freedom, right? Emphasizing these privileges to show superiority. Thus, we start to see this construction of racist ideology in order to keep slaves in their place and to pacify the poor white people who actually have more in common with slaves than they do with the wealthy planter elite. But by bringing racism into the picture, right, as a rationale or a justification, you're going to divide the poor whites and the enslaved Blacks. This shift, again, I've said this before, but this shift from servant to slave is fundamentally not about race, right? If it was just about race, from the get-go, we would have been importing African slaves. It would have been like, well, we hate Black people, so let's make them be our slaves from the start, even if it didn't make economic sense. The shift from indentured servitude to slavery is about labor and about money and about who's going to do the work and who are we going to be able to control most effectively. And we see at first that be indentured servants, and now that is switching to African slaves. So in order to justify owning a person for life, you need to find a way to tell yourself that that's a good idea and tell everyone else that's a good idea. And that's where racism comes into the picture. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Europeans were not racist towards Africans. They absolutely were. But we didn't import African slaves because we wanted to be racist to them. We did it because it made most economic sense. So it's just that difference of like, Europeans definitely looked down on people in Africa. They definitely were racist towards people in Africa. But it wasn't like, hey, we hate people with this color skin, so let's go enslave them all. right? It was, we need the cheapest, most effective form of labor. Where can we find that? I know, we can get some slaves. And who do we enslave? A people we don't care about, right? A people we look down upon. But really, this whole idea, this whole racist ideology is going to be a justification for white people's economic behavior. Hopefully this is making sense to you guys. Please right now jot down any questions that you have for me, because this is a really, really important concept for you to understand, and then ask me when I see you guys on Monday. So please take notes if you need to and write down any questions that you want to discuss. We will talk about this a little further as we begin getting into the middle passage, but just one of the biggest things that I hope that you hold on to is racism as a justification for economic behavior. All right, have a great weekend, you guys. I will see you on Monday.